when we can do well, when we're effective in helping our kids to submit their will, to discipline their will, to what is good, to obedience, right? There's a happier kid.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Maven Parent Podcast. We are once again in our discipline series, and today we are going to talk about kind of the next stage of parenting. So we've covered the younger years actually in 2 episodes and gave some really practical things. And if you missed those, definitely go back, because the practical stuff, we actually think it goes through all your kids' lives, well, all their lives at home while they're home. So some of those practical things are going to apply at all their life stages, but of course they're going to look differently, but definitely that laid a foundation. So today we're going to turn to these next group of years, and we're kind of
We have a technical name for them. They're called the middle years.
The middle years.
These are, these categorizations are not exact and precise.
No.
But they seem to correlate with just different stages of development in kids. So the middle years, we're looking at kind of 8 years old, maybe 9 years old, through kind of middle school. So you got maybe it's your 4th, 5th, 6th through 8th grade or so. And it's going to be different for each kid, but this is where, there's some development in a child's mind. There's some growth. They're able to, at these later stages, think more concretely. And there's some reasoning that's going on. So you're able to, and that's where you want to kind of capitalize on that. And there's some nudging here. There's some nudging in trying to push them into a deeper level of their own moral development, their own character development. And this is where you're really focusing on now giving reasons and explanations. Whereas you got a 3-year-old, you're disciplining your 3 or 4-year-old, you don't sit there and give them a 5-minute explanation of why they shouldn't do this. Often their little minds cannot put together cause and effect so well. They can't follow a line of reasoning very well. And the focus is on obedience at that point versus the explanations, because what you're doing is you're trying to train the will of the child and shape that will so that there are habits of obedience, habits of that really kind of start, I guess, nudging them towards what is good and right. And now with that in place, we're really going to strengthen it with the reasoning. And so we're going to give explanations. And some of those explanations are, hey, you do this and it will result in this. So you are able to now to do some kind of cause effect. This thing, when you break this rule, there is a natural consequence that comes from that brings harm into our lives. So you are now explaining and giving reasons why. And again, it's going to be different in each kid, but at this stage, this is where we're trying to go with them to see that the rules are not just power moves by mom and dad. And again, remember, we're ultimately reflecting back to our kids who God is and kind of God's economy on things, and that God doesn't just give us arbitrary rules simply because he's the sovereign God of all creation and he can do and say whatever he wants because he has the power. We don't want to reflect that back. We don't want to communicate that the rules are simply based and grounded in power, but they're grounded in the nature of God's created world and ultimately back to his character. Yeah. But so therefore, there's going to be good reasons why these rules are in place. And now we're going to start really trying to encourage our kids in these middle years to be thinking about the why.
Yeah, this is when they can start thinking about the why. And like what you're saying, this is where we're showing them the reason we have the moral framework that we live in is because it's good. And so we're kind of demonstrating to them and talking through and explaining the goodness of why we do what we do. So we are in this stage right now with our youngest son. He's 9. And so this is kind of this age. So as we were thinking through this, I just kept thinking of him. Now, of course, we've gone through this stage now with 4 other kids, but it is a fun stage because they're starting to understand so much more. And especially if you've laid the foundation of the early years that we talked about earlier, then they've already been trained towards this stuff, and now you're undergirding it with these reasons. And then they have moments where, and they'll start asking questions. Why do we do this? Or why do we have to do that? Or why do we have to do this or whatever? And you can explain it to them a little bit to where they actually do understand it. And so I think it's a fun stage because you're starting to interact more as like human beings, more as like not human beings, little
mature adults.
Yeah,
there's some maturity that's coming.
There is some maturity, yeah, and I think that's what we want to communicate to you guys is as we parent, we do make shifts, we journey with our kids, and it ought to look different based on where they're at.
I want to highlight what you said there, Erin, about it being fun or enjoyable. This is a stage that we can enjoy it, we can take pleasure in it, and often when we just talk about discipline, most people do not associate enjoyment with the discipline when they think about disciplining their kids. Yeah. So I think we got to pause and highlight that because it speaks to why it's so important for us to lay a good foundation early on. Mm-hmm. When we can do well, when we're effective in helping our kids to submit their will, to discipline their will, to what is good, to obedience, right? There's a happier kid. Mm-hmm. And then it becomes a more enjoyable process for the adult as well, because now it's like, well, we're not struggling with our 9-year-old when we give him basic rules. We're not struggling with him disobeying that all the time. Mm-hmm. Obedience has been trained. Mm-hmm. And again, this is all points back to our, I think, relationship with the Lord. But when there is obedience, when we live in obedience to the Lord, then there's flourishing, there's mm-hmm. happiness, there's a joy that comes with it. And so I just want to highlight that because I think you're right. It can be a very enjoyable process of watching your kids grow in maturity. It's not all drab and mm-hmm. depressing, and it doesn't all have to be a struggle, even though it is sometimes, and there's still mm-hmm. plenty of struggle, but there's also an enjoyment here as well. So, so this is where we can then have some deeper conversations with the kids. Yeah.
So, and I think this shift that we make, and just to emphasize again that you can make the shift if you've done the training. So if you're listening to this and you have an 8-year-old who just really is disobedient and really you need to work on that. We'll go back, listen to the younger years one and work on those things. Like it's not too late, but you'll have maybe some catch up to do, but work on those things because you can then, like they're growing, they're maturing, and you still need to go back to those basic things, but then you can get to the point where you are enjoying your children. And if you're not at this point, it might, if your kids are a little bit older, it might be that you need to go back and do some of that groundwork again, but it's not too late.
Yeah. Yeah. So revisit, sometimes you revisit those things, and it's not this parenting and discipline are not this just line of progress that's just continually going up. No, it's like, Hills and valleys.
Yeah. And actually a story on that, I think is, we've noticed maybe, 6 months ago, I think we both kind of noticed around the same time, but to where our youngest one was just starting to argue back a little more. And part of that is him growing because now he's thinking, so then when we tell him something, he wants to argue back and he wants to plead his case. and you said to him, hey, you're arguing too much. You're not even listening. You're arguing. And so you and I realized, okay, we got to kind of nip this in the bud with him. So it's just that idea of what you're saying, the ebb and flow. So it's not like our 9-year-old is like arrived and all these habits are just perfectly in place. It's like, oh no, we realized, he's gotten in the habit of just arguing back and not listening well. And so we were like, okay, we've got to work on this.
Yeah. And for that in particular, it was like he'd say something, we'd say no, he'd start arguing back, we'd start to kind of dialogue, but he would be cutting us off. Mm-hmm. And so there wasn't any listening, which is important in this stage for your kid to listen to the explanations versus kind of going with their first impulse. Mm-hmm. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 20 talks about explaining to our sons what the statutes and the commandments and the judgments of the Lord mean. And that's kind of what we're getting at. We're trying to get into now the meaning of these things. Mm-hmm. It's not just do this stuff because I said so. And if you don't, there's punishment. But now, okay, why? Yes. What are the explanations?
That's what I like about the Deuteronomy thing. It's because it actually recognizes like your sons, your daughters are going to get to the phase where they say, okay, why does the Lord command these things?
Yeah.
Why
do we do it? What's the meaning of this?
Yeah. So that's a natural thing that's going to happen with our kids.
So why don't we give some examples of this? Because I think that's going to help probably parents who are listening right now get their minds around what this looks like.
Yeah.
I mean, is it a sit down half-hour lecture where you're explaining things? I mean, how does this? Let's just take something like chores, for instance. How does it work out with chores? So it's not just, okay, you need to do your chore. Mm-hmm. You need to go pick up your toys or whatever the chore is. You need to load the dishwasher.
Because what inevitably, okay, so chores is a good example because these are not fun activities, right? So this isn't what our kids wake up wanting to do every day, but it's hopefully we've created the habit of doing it, but they're going to get to a point where they don't want to do it. Or they're over it, so they try to get away with not doing it. And so, we've had conversations with our kids of why do we have to do chores? And so at this stage, you can say, well, we do chores because we all live in this home and we all make a mess, right? Like you make a mess. We all eat off these plates. We all use the bathroom. We all need clean towels. So we have all this work that has to be done. So we have to share it. And so it's just, so you can get, you can start explaining and they can understand that.
Yeah. And sometimes it's even helpful to ask them like, hey, why do you think we have these chores? Mm-hmm. And to just give an indication of maybe where they're at, or just getting them to pause and to do some reflecting, because we live in such a busy, culture and life is often just filled with so much stuff that we don't ever pause and think. So getting your kids to think like, hey, why do you think every one of us is involved in the different chores in the home? And then to pause and let them chew on that and to think through it for themselves, because it's often most effective when they can discover some of that stuff for themselves. And of course, as their understanding is not really filled in well, then we can kind of help them see maybe a little bit more of the bigger picture, right? And get them to think. Like I know one thing that we want our kids to think in terms of are the obligations to other family members. That you are not just this little person on an island all by yourself. You are not this autonomous individual. No, you are part of a family. There are other members of the family, and you are connected with them. And that connection is there's relational connection. There's all kinds of benefits and wonderful things that come from that, love and companionship and all that. But then there are also these corresponding obligations. We have obligations to one another, and one of those things is for all of us to contribute to the household and how well it runs, how clean it is, those kinds of things. And so we'll give some explanations in terms of the obligations that we have.
Yeah. And you're narrating the bigger picture of why. And yeah, an 8-year-old, you might not explain as long as you would to a 12-year-old, but you're giving the reason why and this kind of leads to our next one, which is, part of the why is just the natural cause and effects of life. So you're just kind of explaining this is just life. We have to do things for one another because we live together. And of course, Jesus is teaching to love your neighbor as yourself. Well, part of that is, of course, we serve others, and our neighbor is actually our siblings and our parents and each other. So leads to our next point about.
Before you jump onto the next point, let me add on to that.
Okay.
And kind of from a dad's perspective, one of the things I try to narrate for the kids is the impact. I mean, sticking with this chores example, the impact that it has, particularly on mom, because I think mom in our household feels a lot of the burden of running the house, and so therefore, when dishes don't get done, there's an additional burden, particularly on you, that I want the kids to think through, and to realize that. Okay, not doing the dishes isn't just about you not fulfilling a chore, but no, I want you to feel the obligation of what it does to mom, and trying to kind of feel responsibility for a healthy sense of responsibility for some of the peace of the home, for how well the home runs, realizing, hey, mom has all these other duties that she needs to get done as well. And so there's this whole, ecosystem of the family and how things ought to run. And so I think when it comes to kind of giving some of the explanations of the chores, here's part of the cause and effect. You don't do the dishes. The impact is that, man, it places this extra burden on your mom. And so what you're doing in that too, as you're giving the explanation, it's also trying to nudge them to think outside of just themselves. Right. So,
yeah. So part of that, the cause and effect, in the next thing we want to talk about is starting your older kids now. So older, 8 to 12-ish, letting them experience some of the natural consequences of their actions, I think, is a big part of discipline, and not getting in the way of natural consequences. So something as little as, you didn't clean this up, and so now it's a mess, and you have to clean it up now, and it's not the way you wanted it to be, or whatever. Dishes, you don't do the dishes, so you don't do something well in the morning, you're going to have to do it. That's a natural consequence. You didn't do it. It doesn't just go away. You have to do it later. All the way to, now they're older, so they have other relationships, they have friendships. And if they do something that's mean or rude, or they lie or do something, that you allow the natural consequence of that to happen to them. So if their friend gets upset and doesn't want to talk to them, that you say, well, I understand why your friend feels that way, because you hurt them. And so if they don't want to be around you for a little while, this is what happens when we hurt people. And if they don't finish their homework, then you don't do it for them and you make them go to school without homework and face the natural consequence. So this is kind of what I'm talking about. It's the whole, going to school and our kids have forgotten their lunches. And one of our kids in particular was very good at forgetting her lunch. And so, you remind them, and then you bail them out. But how many times are you going to bail them out? And so it finally took not bailing her out with lunch to get her to actually remember to get her lunch before she left for school. So I let her experience the natural consequence. What do I mean? I didn't impose another consequence. It was just she didn't have lunch at school that day. Now, some mothers are hearing this and like, oh, that's terrible. But how else is she gonna? Because she wasn't learning it by me continuing to bail her out.
Yeah, there's kind of a you can enable that, especially when they get older.
Yes.
Like if it's your 5-year-old, okay, completely understand. We'll bail the 5-year-old out because that's just part of, a 5-year-old at that stage is learning responsibility.
Yeah, you're teaching them to think, okay, what do you need before you go out the door? You need your shoes, you need your lunch, things like that. But yeah.
But if it's your junior higher, if it's your 7th grader, that's when, those lessons need to are reinforced by experiencing the natural consequences.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and I think you would agree. We have seen this a lot that because it comes from this instinct of not wanting our kids to struggle or like have something bad happen, and so we bail them out. And of course, there are appropriate times for parents to step in. They forgot something on accident. I don't know. There are times you need wisdom from that. But if you are seeing a pattern, then that means they're not learning it because they're not feeling any consequence. They need to feel it, and you need to sometimes get out of the way of that natural consequence that should happen. If they forgot their shin guards for soccer practice and their coach has told them, if they forgot, it's letting their coach get mad at them for something and not getting in the way. Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is so countercultural to parenting today. It really is. It's like, no, you go as a parent. You're supposed to go to the parent and approach the coach. If your kid gets in trouble and you're supposed to go yell at the teacher or the coach or whoever, instead of letting your kid feel the consequence of something they did.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a number of cultural factors that play into this. Part of it is just a culture that doesn't take responsibility for its own actions. And that's not what we want to develop in our kids. We want to develop maturity. Maturity is taking responsibility for your own actions. And so this is where it is good to let them feel the weight of, a mistake or a bad decision or whatever, so that it teaches them. It teaches them that they're not just a victim of circumstances. No, but they actually can act. They can be proactive. They can take action. And there are good consequences to those things as well.
Yes.
So, okay, I think at this stage, and this is probably one of the fun parts about this stage, though, that we kind of the flip side of this is not only we give reasons and explanations for what, for the rules that we have for our kids, but then we also now start opening the door to let them challenge some of those rules. But there's some ground rules here to the challenge. You can't. It's not just challenge for challenge sake or challenge because you don't like it. It's that we want you to challenge any rule that you think is unfair or unjust. You don't think the explanation or the reasoning is good. And so our rule in our family is that you can challenge any rule that we have with this caveat. You have to explain why you think it's not a good rule. So you have to, that might mean you might have to address our explanation. And so a kid might say, okay, Dad, what's the reason why we have this rule? and we'll give the explanation, which of course is good for us too as parents, because it might be the case that we have a rule that's in place that was maybe in place when they were 3 and 4, and we just carried it over, and it's maybe there's no need for it anymore. And you think, well, I guess I don't have a good reason for that anymore. Okay, well then we can let that one go.
Yeah.
Right. But so it forces us to be thinking through our own reasons for why we have rules, which helps us to mature. Because oftentimes, a lot of people in their own moral development, in their own maturity, don't get past kind of that rule-based stage. It's only these external standards, and that's the rule, and that's it, right? And you can see they can't go beyond that.
Yeah.
And so it forces some maturity in us. But so our rule is that any rule that we have, I guess that's not a rule. Our guideline, or our the culture in our home is that any rule can be challenged, but you have to give an explanation of why you don't think that rule is good.
Yeah. And I'm smiling because I'm thinking about our youngest one last year was challenging me about his bedtime. And of course, he's the youngest, so everyone stays up later than him, and that upsets him because he's very social and he doesn't want to go to bed when everyone's still awake. So he was complaining to me about his 8 o'clock bedtime. And so we had a conversation where he said, I think I should at least be able to stay up till 8:30, talking about a school night or whatever. And so I said, okay, but you need, at least 9 to 10 hours of sleep every night, or 9 hours, I might have said, or something like that. So we talked about when he has to get up and counted back basically how many hours of sleep. So then as I was thinking about it, I thought, well, I have had this bedtime for him for a while. And then he is getting older. So after we had that conversation, I said, okay, I think you could probably stay up till 8:30, maybe even 9. And because with homeschooling, we don't have to get up quite as early as for public school. I know some when you're going to school, you have to get up quite early. Anyway, so we negotiated this, and I ended up moving his bedtime later. He was thrilled.
You only gave him half an hour extra?
I know, I'm trying to think. I don't know. It was somewhere in there, but he negotiated with me. We had a respectful conversation. He's not allowed to whine or be rude or whatever. That's what you're talking about. It's kind of like we have these rules of engagement, just like, they can challenge, but like in boxing, you have rules. So we can argue in the debate sense, but you have to be respectful and you have to have good reasons. And he brought that to me, and I thought, yeah, he's gotten older, and I'm just still kind of treating him like a baby. And so, okay, you can stay up later. So that was just one time I can think of, even of the top of my head. But we have had our kids at different times come and challenge rules.
Yeah, I think recently our high schooler kind of asked us about changing up some of the rules in terms of cell phone and how late that, we've kind of had a cell phone curfew, where it's supposed to be off and at the charging station by, 10 o'clock. And, she's a senior in high school, and she's challenged that and said, here are the reasons why. And so we took that into account, and we adjusted that. And so I think what this has done for our kids, I think the benefit is that, number one, they feel like we can have a reasonable conversation. Mom and dad are going to be reasonable, and they're not going to go on a power trip and just we'll absolutely never say to them, this is the rule because I said so at this stage. Now, when they're 2 years old, again, it's different. We're doing something different, but now we're trying to move them into deeper maturity. And so when our kids are in junior high and high school, we're never, ever making an appeal just to brute power and authority. We want to back up that authority with good reasons and explanations. And so I think our kids feel like they can come and they can challenge it, and they don't have to, just rebel because they don't like it. and plus they end up getting to hear our reasons, because you don't always, when you have a rule, you haven't always explicitly stated the reason. So it gives us opportunities to talk through those things more. And it just, I think, created I guess the word might be like allies. I feel like we're allies with the kids on these things.
Yeah.
And it's not as combative. It's not us against you. We're always trying to give the explanation, and it's tied into our vision of their good, what we want for them, maturity, character, godliness, all of those good things.
Yeah, I think too, like you think about the discussion I had with Jonah or the discussion we had with our high schooler, and how these things are dignifying to them because we spend time listening to their reasons, even an 8-year-old's little reasons on why he wants to stay up later. But that's dignifying. Like when someone listens to you, that it feels good. Now, even if at the end we disagree, and there have been times where our kids have tried to change a rule and we're like, sorry, those aren't good reasons. But if you feel listened to and heard, that there's something about that, even if you end up not getting what you want, that is really dignifying just as a person. And I think also too, this models for our kids on how you make decisions too, because we want to teach them to think about reasons why. And then we'll talk about this a little bit more in the teenage years, but we want them to think through how you make decisions, and how you make decisions is thinking through the reasons of why you would do something and why you wouldn't. And so this starts them actually at an early age of saying, if you want to do something, you need to have a good reason for it. So I think there's so many benefits to it, and it does foster a good relationship with us, with the kids. It really does. Because then instead of challenging the high schooler challenging at 11 o'clock at night, and we go and say, hey, why isn't your phone charged? Well, I wasn't done with this. And then it ends up in a fight. When we sit down and have these conversations, it's calm, it's reasoned, we're listening, and it just does help to foster a good relationship between us and them, where they hopefully don't feel like we're just, putting our thumb down on them and that's it.
Okay, so all of that to say, at this stage, there's a lot of reasoning. There's a lot of explanation that you're trying to give in discipline, in correction, because you're moving them to maturity, and you're wanting them to ultimately take ownership, which is going to get us kind of moving in the direction of the third stage and what we want to see accomplished by the time they're in high school and college. But before we go to that in our next podcast, because we're going to have a whole separate podcast for that, the high school years, the later years, the teen years. We want to make sure that the parents understand there are still consequences at this age. It's not like, okay, now we've reached this level of discipline nirvana, and we can just explain to our reasonable children why we do what we do, and they accept it, and
they'll see the clarity of it,
yes,
and the goodness of it.
Discipline bliss. No, there's still consequences at this age, because it's ups and downs. It's not all right, you've left this stage behind and now you're into this second stage. That's, I think, some of the difficulty with talking about stages. It's not like you've fully left behind. It's more this just kind of the spectrum of growth. And so there's still going to be consequences that are offered. There's still going to be times when a kid's disobedient, and they're going to break rules and they're going to push. And so, hey, know what they love so you can take it away. Remember, what was it, 2-3 podcasts ago? Erin made that statement, really shook the internet there. You're looking for what your kid loves so you can take it away. No, that's where consequences are, important. Yeah. And there's still going to be some of that discipline and that punishment that is going to happen at this stage, even though you're still nudging them forward.
It's what we talked about earlier about pain. We learn through pain. Adults do too. We don't speed on the road, because we know if we get a speeding ticket, especially in California, it's like almost $400. I mean, that is painful. So we avoid that, right?
We've personally experienced that pain, thanks to Erin.
Oh, whatever. So yeah, like this is how we function as humans, right? We avoid pain. And so this is how we learn things. And the toddler with the stove, they learn not to touch it because it's super hot and they burned their fingers last time. So that's
they're not beyond, at this stage in the middle years, they're not beyond still needing those lessons.
No, and really at this stage is, you continue to grow with your kids. So at the younger stage, discipline as far as like consequences, it has to be more quick. Like you can't say to a 3-year-old, okay, you did that, so you don't get to go on Saturday to the movie with grandma. Like, and it's Tuesday. That's way too far away. You might as well be talking about another year, So with 3-year-old, 4-year-old, it has to be more immediate.
That's actually a good point. We got to put that into the notes for discipline. That might be another practical thing to add. Discipline needs to be a little bit more immediate. Mm-hmm. The consequences need to be kind of closer to that event of disobedience or whatever.
Yeah, which really just again respects the child, because they just have you say to a 5-year-old, a time frame, and it means almost nothing to them. Like they don't have the concept of like an hour from now this is going to happen. So because of that, because we know them and respect them and love them, it has to be immediate, because it has to wake them up right in the moment.
Yeah, otherwise they won't connect. It's difficult for a younger child to connect what they did an hour, 2 hours ago with now here's the consequence.
Yes. So this stage now, they are older. And so you can say, in our house, we pretty much, there's no screens during the week, especially when school's going on. But Saturday morning is, they can have cartoons or whatever for a couple hours. Okay, so we can say to our 9-year-old, that can be a punishment that's taken away. Like, okay, you've lost your screen time this week. Mm-hmm. Because he understands days. He can, so you can, your punishments or your consequences start to change because they're changing and they're growing and they understand. And so this is why you can do something that really is impactful to them, that they're going to feel, and it's going to cause them to change course.
Yeah, it's like getting grounded for the week, getting grounded from technology for the week, mm-hmm. or whatever, Saturday morning cartoons or whatever it is. Yeah, it can be something that happens over time, because they are more now concrete in their thinking, and they can connect cause and effect.
Yeah, and like I think I've shared this story before, but if you have a kid, like one of our kids, when they had just gotten their phone, so they're 13, 14, but every time they did something, their phone was the first thing that would get taken away. And, they're very upset why every time they do something, they get in trouble or they get their phone taken away.
Why is that the punishment?
And I said to them, well, that's what you care about most. If I told you can't watch TV, you wouldn't care because you don't watch TV. If I told you can't do, so knowing your kid personality, this is why knowing what they love and care about, one of our teenagers now is so social. So if we take away a social activity, that is so upsetting.
That's what we call an effective punishment.
Yes, and all we have to do with making sure their chores get done is to say, okay, if your chores aren't done, you're not going anywhere. Mm-hmm. Oh, well, you will not believe, but the chores actually get done. And so that's the kind of thing. Knowing them, knowing what's appropriate as far as consequence is very helpful. So again, it's growing with our kids and figuring out what's going to get their attention, what's going to let them know we're not going to tolerate this, whatever it was, disobedience, lying, not doing something they're supposed to do, whatever it is. And it's getting their attention that, hey, this behavior isn't going to be tolerated.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think that covers the middle years well and what we're trying to do there primarily. And again, it's think about you're just building upon the foundation. That is maybe the better than stages. It's like, okay, we built this foundation in those younger years. We're continuing to build on top of it. And some of that stuff that you do in the younger years, it just extends through the middle years and all the older years, the young adult years, which we'll get to in our next podcast. Maven exists to help the next generation know truth, pursue goodness, and create beauty for the cause of Christ. To find out more, check out maventruth.com.